Opportunity to speak with you all today. As you suggested, I'll start a little bit about the Commissioner's Office. Some of this, many of you may already know, but probably not all of you. The city commissioners in Philadelphia are elected to 4-year terms, and we have one very narrow but very important responsibility, and that's running elections in Philadelphia. Anything from voter registration to absentee or now mail-in ballots to election day operations and the final computation and certification of the election results are done by the city commissioner's office. So we are an operating department of the city government, but not underneath the mayor. We have independent leadership, and we have 3 city commissioners, and only 2 can be from the same party. So for the past 50 or more years, it's been 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. And I'm the Republican who was elected in 2011 and came into office in 2012, and then reelected in 2015 and 2019. And this will be my last term. I'm not term limited, but it's not a legislative position. And it's always been my opinion that you got elected to do a job. And if I can't get that job done in 12 years, it's time for someone else to give it a shot who might succeed wherever I wasn't successful. So my term is up in January 2024, which is still a little while off here. This election in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia was a really, it was a heavy lift. We had a confluence, or a constellation rather, of factors that were new. One was obviously all this was taking place in the current COVID environment, which inhibits our ability to have all the polling places we normally have, recruit the election workers we normally have, train those election board workers the way that we normally do. We also had, and I thought I was not happy when the Wolf administration made us do this, and I went into it kicking and screaming, but they were right and I was wrong. And that was forcing all the counties in Pennsylvania to acquire new voting systems in advance of the presidential election, where every vote that's cast, you have a paper record, which is an ink on paper, human readable record of how the voters cast their votes. The Wolf administration forced the counties to do this election by the time the presidential election occurred. And that was a real struggle. And we worked very hard to roll that new voting system out in the general election of 2019, so that at least probably 30 to 35% of our voters in the presidential election will have at least voted on it 1 or more times prior to the presidential general election, so that they have experience interfacing with that new voting system. And for a lot of people, because turnout is higher in a presidential general election, for a lot of them, it was the first time. And frankly, without knowing anything about COVID, and that's even before Act 77 came about at the end of 2019, which reformed the way that we vote, or the methods available to us to vote, I thought a new voting system alone would be just an incredible challenge to overcome. And it turned out being only one of several, and probably the easiest one to overcome of them all. The third biggest challenge we faced was that Act 77, passed at the end of 2019 by the Republican House and Republican Senate and signed by a Democratic governor, created mail-in voting in Pennsylvania, no excuse absentee voting, it's called in some other places, where any voter, if they choose, can cast their vote by mail. In Pennsylvania, you have to apply, you have the ballot sent to you, you fill out the ballot, and you send it back. So some states mail everybody a ballot. We don't do that. You have to apply for a mail-in ballot in Pennsylvania. In the primary, which was occurring, if you recall, the COVID environment had already come about prior to that. About half of our voters in Philadelphia voted by mail in the primary election. In the general election, about half of our voters voted by mail in the general election. Operationally, voting by mail is essentially like running two separate elections at the same time. We still have in-person voting in Pennsylvania, where you go in to vote in your local polling place. And now we also have mail-in voting. Lots of states have one or the other, and we have both, mail-in and in-person voting available to voters. A couple good things about that. One is, normal people have normal lives, and the window to vote is only 13 hours on one day in the primary and one day in the general. And if you're working two jobs, if you're a firefighter and your shift is from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m., it's hard to make it within that 13-hour window. And even if you're a firefighter, risking your life, you weren't eligible for an absentee ballot because you weren't absent from the county on election day. So mail-in voting will hopefully increase and make more available voting to people who otherwise, because of their everyday lives, would not be able to vote in that 13-hour window. Another real advantage to it that we saw is because, although some places it takes many years to make people accustomed to voting by mail, probably because of COVID, probably because of the presidential election, we went from 0 to 50% of our voters, like I said, voting by mail. Most states take, it's incremental. It's 5%, 15%, 20%. We went from 0 to 50%. And that was a lot operationally to manage. Our real advantage to that is, other than the new voters who are coming in who otherwise couldn't have voted on election day, that meant the line that you saw if you voted in person on election day at your polling place was half as long as it would have been. Because half of our voters would have already cast their votes by mail on or before election day. So if we have turnout of 700,000 people, 350,000 of them voted by mail. That's 350,000 fewer people in line to vote on election day, meaning the lines move faster, lines in their own way disenfranchise voters because, like I said about people in their regular lives, they may go and they're like, I don't have an hour to wait in line. Fortunately, we're very spoiled in Philadelphia by that, because we have 1,703 divisions or precincts, 1,703 election boards with more than 8,000 people working on election day to make election day possible, which are far more important than the city commissioners. On election day, and if any of you have served on election boards, I'm grateful for your service. The election happens or doesn't happen because of your service on that election board. You are the most important people in Philadelphia as far as elections go. On election day is your neighbor who might be a judge of elections or majority inspector or minority inspector or clerk or person working the machine. So with 1,703 divisions or precincts, 8,000 election board workers, thousands of new machines and all the rest, the election went surprisingly smoothly from an operational perspective. Now, that's a relative thing, because election day was just complete hell. There wasn't a moment where there wasn't a call or some issue we were addressing. But that doesn't mean the election wasn't a relatively smooth election, which I think it was. And that certainly, in my experience, has been the broader assessment out there. That doesn't mean that different voters didn't encounter different challenges. It happens at every election, whether it's a presidential general election or next year is our district attorney city controller election, where there will be judges on the ballot, the DA and the controller. Turnout last time was, I think, 18%. Turnout the time before that was 9%. In 2013, we had 9% of voters vote in that election. And it's pretty perverse when you think about it. And I don't want to digress too much on this, but turnout is so much higher for offices that affect your lives less. Or I say it conversely, turnout is much lower for a lot of offices that affect your lives every day, whether it's the district attorney or the city controller, ensuring that there isn't waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement of government services, and that they're elected efficiently and delivered efficiently and effectively, and all of that. That turnout is 9%, not 60 or 70%. So this election, we had very high turnout, highest in, I think, more than 30 years. Voter registration had been also about the same, highest in more than 30 years. And with a new whole system of voting, which was voting by mail. The election, from election day on, the city commissioners, we had to pay for it, but we essentially commandeered the Pennsylvania Convention Center and had the run of the place to give us the space that we needed for this operation. Our department is only about 100 employees year round. Normally around election time, we hire many dozens of temporary employees. This time we had hundreds of full-time employees working for us. They still don't work for us, but we pulled them from other city departments across the city. So if you were a water revenue clerk, you probably were helping us out entering voter registration applications or processing mail-in ballots or all the rest, or all sorts of people from different departments, from the city controller's office to the DA's office to, the managing director's office sent a lot of people to help us out. The administration was terrific in helping us with the resources that we needed and the personnel that we needed to get the job done, because there's no redos when it comes to elections. So it was important that we get it right. The computation of the election went on as it usually does from election day to the next 20 days after the election. That's when you're counting all the votes that were cast in person and were cast by mail. Normally it takes us about 15 days to count 10 or 20,000 absentee ballots. And this time we had that same amount of time to count hundreds of thousands of ballots, and manage all of that. So we were able to certify the election in time in Philadelphia, so that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was able to certify the election in time. Looking back, it was just one other quick digression. It was a really surreal kind of experience. We were all in this great big bunker at the Pennsylvania Convention Center with hardly any windows or anything else. It was a really surreal experience to realize that kind of much of the world, or much of the United States, and certainly the Commonwealth, had their attention focused on us, but we were largely separated from all of it. We did, the city commissioners, City Commissioner Lisa Deely, who's our chairperson, did a fantastic job working with the Kenney administration and getting the resources that we needed. City Commissioner Omar Sabir also sort of each brought something to this. And the city commissioner's office, it's a strange creature. Most elections in other cities aren't run that way. And that could be good or could be bad. It's intended to be structured in an almost slightly inefficient way where you have checks and balances to it all. You have minority party representation, whether it's Republicans or someone else, you have minority party representation on that election board. And I think in this election cycle, that helped, because it wasn't just a matter of taking a mayor's word for it or one election administrator's word for it. You had checks and balances sort of built into that system. So like I said, the city commissioner's office has sort of strengths and weaknesses and a little bit quirky and awkward in how it functions, can't deliberate outside of big public meetings. But this election cycle, I think, went very smoothly, and we were able to work together to get that done, even though we don't always see eye to eye and agree with one another. I've talked for, I guess, about 25 minutes. Would you like to sort of open it up to questions or other specific things that you'd like me to speak to?
Sure, I can do that. There are a few questions in here, so I'm going to start clicking the ones sort of that came in order. And Andy, you can add any other questions or parts that you want. Let me start with, I'm just, again, if you want to ask a question, please type it, just say, raise your hand or type, I want to ask a question in the chat box, and I'll click on you again in order there. And the first one I see is a question is from Magali Larson. I'm gonna unmute you if I can find your, there you are. So you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question now. Did you?
Now it's okay?
Yeah, it's good. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Carl Schmidt. I remember when he came to be endorsed by Philly for Change, and I'm glad we did endorse him. But his operation, he was a real hero of the election because of the tremendous pressures that he was being submitted. I was to talk about those pressures. I don't have to argue this because the data are enormous, but the Pennsylvania Republicans are trying once again to eliminate vote by mail as they are doing in other states. And their attitude toward voter suppression, as we all know, is embracing it enthusiastically. So I would like to know, because of the respect I have for Al Schmidt, what does he think we can do to guarantee the largest possible expansion of the vote, which I believe is essential in a democracy.
Thank you for your question, Ms. Larson. And I think there's what we need to do and what we need to avoid doing.
Yes.
And right now, I think what you're seeing in Harrisburg is a lot of legislation, much of it attempting to address problems that were not actually problems. And that there's no evidence that they're problems. So you can change the law in some way to combat something that didn't happen and potentially risk disenfranchising voters or intentionally disenfranchising voters. I can't speak to people's motives, but there's a real danger. There's an expression, you should never believe your own propaganda. And frequently in political environments, I think people believe their own propaganda. There is your message to try to rev up your voters and drive up your turnout and all the rest. But that doesn't mean it's true. And it doesn't mean that it's an actual problem that requires correction. And what I don't know right now is if a lot of legislators are, Andy, you said these things are sometimes kind of spicy, or I forgot what you said. So forgive me if I'm a little clumsy with my wording. But there are people out there that I can't figure out if they're fools or liars because they're trying to pass legislation to fix things that did not occur. And that's a danger. But even though Act 77, I think, made it more easy for people to vote, or at least it created another method for people to cast their vote. And even though there were reforms in 2020, which were reforms to the election reforms, hopefully now we will see some reforms to the reforms to the reform before, because there are still issues that have to be worked out. One of those is that in Pennsylvania, boards of elections cannot begin processing mail-in ballots, declaration envelopes and all the rest, prior to 7 a.m. on election day. Other states, they can begin doing it 5 days or 15 days or something like that, so that on election morning, they can begin counting mail-in ballots. 7 a.m., you begin scanning mail-in ballots. 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, to Erie, to Pittsburgh, to Allentown, we can only begin processing the mail-in declaration envelopes at 7 a.m. on election morning, which really delays a lot of that process. So some states like Florida, they have mail-in voting. Lots of their people vote by mail, and we know their results by midnight or 1 a.m. In Pennsylvania, and a city like Philadelphia, it then takes days, because it's days of work processing hundreds of thousands of pieces of paper, the declaration envelope and the review process that goes on there, extracting the secrecy envelope from the declaration envelope, extracting the ballot from the secrecy envelope, unfolding the ballot and running it through scanners, optical scanners that record the vote. Like, allowing Pennsylvania, one important change, I think, and I would hope would be embraced by Republicans and Democrats, would be allowing counties to begin processing mail-in ballots. Even if you don't count a single ballot, allow them to process mail-in ballots with party and campaign observers there in advance of 7 a.m. on election morning. So there are some good things that we can do, and there are some things that I think we need to avoid doing that disenfranchise voters.
Okay, I'm going to another question to Gerald Moss. Gerald, sounds like Al answered part of your question, but you did have another one there, so go ahead. Gerald, you need to unmute yourself.
If you can just read that, that would be fine.
Got it. Okay, so the question is, you did discuss things that Republican-controlled legislature could do and that sort of thing. He asks here about an election week or an election day holiday. And I didn't hear you mention that. Is there any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's certainly not under the city controller's authority. Neither are these changes to the election code. I mean, more broadly, I would be in favor of anything that makes it easier for eligible voters to register to vote and registered voters to cast their vote on election day. You always have to balance access and security. And that's what I think is always important. When you make elections more accessible, you also have to pay attention to the security side of that and any sort of concerns that you'd need to make or work out in advance of election day. One thing that we saw this time, which was a real frustration, is being able to communicate to voters what the laws are and what they can do and not do. All this litigation hit much of it at the very last minute. Last minute doesn't necessarily mean the day before election day. It can be weeks or even a few months before election day. But if a lot of this had been sorted out after the primary election, where we had the exact same system, almost, there was a change in mail-in ballots and whether you can vote on the machine or not in the general compared to the primary. But hitting all these election boards with all this litigation at the last minute, waiting for judges to make decisions, waiting for those decisions to be appealed, really impeded our ability to communicate clearly with voters about what the rules were. And it's great being on this call because I see lots of people that I know and have seen a lot. I also see plenty of people that I've talked to during that time who have asked these very questions, like Gail. I don't think we've ever met. Or there's others too that I know their name, I know their voice, but I've never seen you all before. And a lot of that is because voters, no matter how involved they are, no matter if you're the League of Women Voters or whatever, you still are unsure about what the laws are and what voters can do and not do, because that had not been settled in the lead up to election day. And I think that was a very unsettling thing for voters. They applied for a ballot, they mailed their ballot in. Do they know we got their ballot and they're showing up on election day too? And can they do this? Can they not do this? No one wants to break the law, but how do you, there was just so much uncertainty and so much litigation, an avalanche of litigation. The city solicitor's department, the city solicitor's office did an extraordinary job representing us in this cycle. And I wish they had been called upon, and a lot of this legislation, or a lot of this litigation had hit earlier after the primary, so we would all know kind of what the rules were going into the general election. I'm sorry for that sort of tangent, but it's something, the litigation component of it was not an insignificant part of what consumed so much of our time and attention leading into the general election and created, I think, a lot of uncertainty.
I'm going to go to Rich Gorella. Rich, you're unmuted. Go ahead and unmute.
Yes, good morning, Commissioner.
Morning, Rich.
I wanted to know the rights of party and candidate observers became a big point of contention during the November election canvass, as you know. And I'm wondering if you think that changes in Pennsylvania election code went too far in reducing the rights of these observers in terms of how close they could be, whether they could win, and whether they could challenge decisions. Do you think that any of these rights should be restored or strengthened in order to improve election transparency and reduce some of that contention?
I think that's a good question. It was also something that there was a lot of, like I mentioned, uncertainty about going into the thing. Every election that we have when we complete or conduct computation, which is really counting of the votes, takes place in a room where observers can observe what's going on. What that really means is they can look at what's going on. And there's certainly a discrepancy, I think, between what the law allows, or what we believe and judges have agreed with that the law allows, and the amount of scrutiny that observers would like to have, right? They would like to see that ballot up close. They would like to be able to scrutinize if we're talking about mail-in ballots,
Right.
They would like to scrutinize every ballot. And at the same time, we have 20 days to certify the election. And the election code for us involved creating a perimeter for observers to observe this process. That's different from scrutinizing individual ballots. There's a component of that when it comes to, and you meant Rich and your people, I think, were familiar with this because they were there during what was called ballot recreation, which is when a ballot is damaged in some way, either when the ballot envelope is opened and the ballot is cut in half, or the ballot is just mashed up and unreadable when it's delivered through the postal service, or someone spills coffee on it or something like that. The city commissioners here and other counties do something called ballot recreation, which is taking the damaged ballot, which is taking a new blank ballot, transferring what the selections were from the voter, attaching them together, holding them up so that observers can see, here are the votes cast by the voter, here are the votes entered on the undamaged ballot. Like that process was actually fairly, I don't know if this is the right word, but fairly intimate. Like the observers really had something to do. We're holding them up, you're saying like, yeah, that looks right. Or no, that doesn't look right. That level of scrutiny doesn't exist really with the rest of the process. With the rest of the process, observers are observing, they're watching. They're watching ballot envelopes or mail-in ballot envelopes get opened, ballots extracted, and all the rest. And there's very limited interaction. There was a bunch of litigation around all of that, if you recall. Sure. There was a common pleas court decision that had us move that perimeter a few steps closer. So compared to on election morning, and then when that first case from a common pleas court judge came in, we moved it. I think it went to state Supreme Court and federal court, but we were still able to do it despite moving the barrier like a little bit closer, which that common pleas court judge wanted us to do and said we could do. A real fear of ours this election cycle that we hopefully will not have in other election cycle is that it's easy to talk about this now, but if our people got sick, we would not have been able to certify the election. If someone tested positive, they and all the other people they work with would have to no longer come to work with us for the next couple of weeks. That was a real concern. And that actually happened at the very end of the certification process, where we had, I think it was about a dozen of our people test positive. The proximity for people being next to one another was a real concern this election in terms of how close people can be, because it would have crippled our operation at the end of the day. And we would not have been able to certify the election, period. We were able to do it at the end because it was at the very end. We were processing, if you recall, like provisional ballots at that point. We were kind of wrapping up when we started losing not just all the people who tested positive, but all the other people who worked with the people who were testing positive, who tested positive. So hopefully that is a concern we won't have in the future, that will allow a little bit, maybe reduce the proximity of observers in the process. But right now, the law doesn't really provide for any observer individual scrutiny of ballots.
Did it?
I'm sorry?
Okay, I'm going to go to.
Can I just jump in here for a quick second, Tom?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
On that, because I think it also relates to Gail Hopfer's question, which is if there are some minor issues with the ballot, normally you, like if you're going in person, you have a chance to rectify that, or you've marked something wrong and you want to fix it. With the ballots, there was some questions about people coming back, and I think in other places they were able to actually go and fix, like they forgot to dot an I or something, and then they were called in, the voter was called in to be able to fix that problem. Is that something, and that relates to the outer and inner envelope, and making sure everything's exactly right. I think there was a lot of stress over making sure everything was perfect for every voter, and some people didn't do it exactly right.
Yeah, I think there's two, there's that and another thing related to it. But with that, some counties and some places allow for ballots to be cured, it's called. Mm-hmm. So the voter sends in a mail-in ballot and they didn't sign it. They allow the voter to come in and sign the ballot. We don't do that. What we were able to do is, if we got the ballot in advance, identify whether that ballot declaration was signed or not. If it's not signed, it's a fatal defect. That ballot is not going to be counted. It can't be counted if it's not signed. Identify ballots that came in that were not signed so that voters could be notified that their ballot was not going to count, and they could still show up on election day at their polling place and complete a provisional ballot, which is not voting twice, because the original ballot is not going to get counted. That original ballot is dead. And I think every election administrator, I would hope, feels the same way, that every vote is precious. And you don't want to disenfranchise someone because they are on the way out of the door to drop their kids off at daycare, licked the envelope, sealed it, and put it in the mail and didn't sign it. That's a registered voter. It's not a question about whether this is a legitimate voter casting an eligible vote or not. It's a voter screwing up and not completing that ballot. So if the opportunity is available to at least let voters know that their ballot won't be counted and that they can still show up on election day and cast a provisional ballot at their polling place, which is essentially a mail-in ballot, but filled out at the polling place, I don't see what the harm in that is. There's only one vote cast by one eligible voter. And I would hope that's something that all counties do, because some counties did and some counties didn't. Shame on counties that don't do it. And maybe it's because they can't. Some counties have, we had hundreds of people. Some counties had 12. And maybe they don't have the capacity. And maybe we won't always have the capacity to do some of the things that we do. But at the end of the day, if you only have eligible voters, an eligible voter casting an eligible vote, you should do everything you can to make that possible. There was a lot of attention to the issue Rich raised about observers. There was a lot of attention to the issue that you raised about curing ballots. And the other thing that we saw a lot of was a ton of litigation about ballots received after Election Day. So normally those ballots have to, well, on election day at 5 o'clock, we would have to have those ballots, mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, or whatever else in hand on election day for them to be counted. This year, it was extended till the Friday after election day, provided it was mailed on or before election day. I'm sympathetic to accepting ballots later, provided that they're postmarked on or before election day, even though that's not the purpose of postmarks. The purpose of postmarks is to cancel postage. It's not to document when something is mailed. But all counties were required to count all mail-in ballots received up to Friday after election day, unless they had a postmark on them showing it was mailed after election day. If it had a postmark showing it was mailed on or before, it was counted. And if it had no postmark on it, it was counted. And that's something that I've been in touch with Harrisburg trying to correct. I personally am uncomfortable with counting ballots that there isn't a record for when it was mailed. Because even though the post office takes a long time right now, I know that I could conceivably mail something on a Wednesday and it could reach us by a Friday. I know that it's probably postmarked, but it may not be. And a lot of that issue, well, let me get to my first point. First point was tons of litigation, lots of fighting about it. We had fewer than 1,000 of those. That's nothing. I mean, if an election is close, that's a lot. When an election is tens of thousands of votes different, it was 1,000 of them Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, which is really not all that many. That speaks to, I think, a lot of the effort groups did to make sure that, hey, get your ballot in, get your ballot in, get your ballot in. Also with the naked ballot thing that you probably heard a lot about, which I can talk to if you want, like we didn't have all that many of those. It was pretty remarkable. But all this litigation about late arriving ballots, and in the end, it was only about 1,000. It really wasn't all that much. So it speaks, I think, to a lot of voter education to make sure people got their ballots in the mail on time.
Matt Wolf has been waiting to ask a question. You touch on a lot of his points, I think, that he wrote about, but Matt, go ahead.
Well, I just like to hear you talk a little bit about the logistics of your operation. As you know, I was down there for a few days, and you had all this equipment, all these people. There was a workflow. There were signs up as to what each station was supposed to be at. I'd be curious to see what went into creating that. I'm presuming you had some industrial engineers, outside consultants that helped you with it. I'd also be curious, I think it flows from it with the cost. I know that your budget was roughly doubled by an outside grant. Now, this year's election is not going to cost as much as last year's election, we think. But going forward, how do you plan to pay for all that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. There have been a couple of articles written about it, like, hey, everyone was eager to help before, now what? I think our budget is normally around $10 to $12 million. It was this year, but we also got a $10 million grant in addition to that, like Matt was saying. And that grant, and it was important to use those dollars right, because you don't want to use them in any way that affects the outcome of the election. You don't want to say, hey, we need to spend money to, let's say Republicans would be like, hey, let's spend all the money to increase turnout in Northeast Philadelphia or South Philadelphia. You don't want to use it in a way that impacts the outcome. But we were able to use that money with a lot of voter education. And we're able to use that money with a lot of machinery to help us do the work that normally regular human beings have to manually do. So those big machines that you saw there in the convention center, Matt, they all had a different role. And by far the most useful was one that was a sorter that, with Philadelphia's 66 wards and 1,703 precincts, we needed to be able to sort those mail-in ballots by ward and division in case we needed to find them. And I can tell you why, and it's an election integrity component to this. Normally, we had to do all that by hand. And Rich, I think you were an observer in the primary, and Matt, I think you were an observer in the primary, and some of the others of you were. You probably saw our people with stacks of envelopes, organizing them into 66 piles. Well, first it's 6 piles. It's like wards 1 through 10, 11 through 20. So we had to do all that work by hand, hundreds of thousands of ballots organized by ward and division by hand, which is just incredibly time consuming. We're able to use these machines to sort them by ward and division. That was incredibly helpful in allowing us to get the election certified in time. The reason why we have to sort them by ward and division is for 2 things. One, if a voter said, "Hey, I never got an email. I mailed my thing in. I never got a ping that said, 'Hey, you received my ballot.'" If they contacted us, we were able to, okay, we're looking for Al Schmidt, 21st Ward, 4th Division. We can find it. We can say, "Hey, Al, yeah, we have your ballot." The other thing from an election integrity standpoint is if you vote by mail, you want to make sure that people who voted by mail also don't vote on the voting machines on election day. So there's sometimes what you'll see is a rush where we're counting ballots, and then a real abrupt slowdown, and then a rush again. And some of that occurs because all those poll books, when you voted in person, and I'm sure all of you have voted in person at one point or another, you go into the polling place, you sign the poll book. Next to your name is a little barcode, and that's tied to your voter registration record. And our clerks scan those barcodes after all those poll books, thousands of them, come back to us, so we can see who voted on election day, who voted on the machines on election day. And then if you vote on the machine, it allows us to see Al Schmidt. He voted on the voting machine at 21st Ward for 4th Division at Chaumont School. But we also see that he sent us a mail-in ballot. So then we have to go through and find 21st Ward, 4th Division, and void Al Schmidt's mail-in ballot because he voted on the voting machine. That's something that really slows the process down, but is like an election integrity component of it to sort of prevent people from voting twice. And that's not to suggest that people voting twice are engaging in voter fraud. Very likely they mailed their ballot at the last minute. Maybe they didn't give us an email address so the Department of State would ping them to say, "Hey, we got your ballot." They're unsure whether their vote is cast or not. It's a presidential election. They really give a damn about making sure their vote is cast. They put it in the mail, they never heard back, they go and they vote in person. Well, the remedy to that is that we are able to identify and pull and void their mail-in ballot.
I'm going to go to, you've addressed a lot of the questions that are piling up here. Al,
Sorry for my long answers.
Yeah, very interesting, good questions, and you have addressed a lot of them. I'm going to go right to Patrick Starr, who actually asks about something you just related to what you just said. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Patrick, and ask your question.
Oh, okay. Wow. Commissioner, thank you so much. You're so clear and you were so impressive through the whole process. One thing that I am not a believer and subscriber to conspiracy theories, but I have to say that I wonder, given the maelstrom you became caught up in, whether it ever had crossed your mind that the General Assembly's reluctance to address the pleas from the 67 counties and many others for additional time to canvass was part of constructing the big lie and creating the opportunity for the big lie. I just wonder if you have any opinion about that. I mean, that's certainly something that some people think. I don't know what to believe about that.
So Patrick, I am definitely not a conspiracy believer. I'm an anti-conspiracy believer, and yet
I would put myself in that category, Commissioner. I don't believe.
And yet I think that it was either a product of one or two things. It was either a product of, listen, everybody thinks that ballots should be able to be processed in advance of election day, so you get results faster. But what do I get for voting that way? And that could be it. That would be like the least nefarious explanation. Even though it's distasteful. A more nefarious explanation was we were hearing two things. One, you can't begin processing any mail-in ballots before election morning. And two, you got to tell us the results on election day. Those two things can't coexist. We can't process hundreds of thousands of mail-in ballots. I don't care if we have 1,000. I don't care if we have 10,000 people working for us. We can't process all those mail-in ballots and for you to know the results by midnight on election night. So we were seeing from the legislature having a foot on the gas and a foot on the brakes at the same time. It was, you can't do any of this early, but we got to know the results right away. And if we don't know the results right away, there must be something going on here. Why is it taking so long for Philly to give us the results? They must be trying to figure out how many votes they need to cook up or whatever to get those results. And that was a real frustration. An advantage was we saw it coming starting in October, and we noticed it first on social media. There was clearly a campaign underway to discredit the results in Philadelphia before a single vote was counted. How can count the results in Philadelphia? Newt Gingrich is like, they should send federal troops into Philadelphia to straighten out what's sort of going on there with the election. Before a single vote is counted, there was clearly a message, and it was all hitting at the same time, to discredit the results in Philadelphia. So at least we saw it coming. They're very transparent. They weren't even trying to hide, I think, what they were doing, which was to discredit those results, expecting that the results are going to be sort of one way or another. But hopefully that will be, sorry to sound naive, Patrick, hopefully it'll be one of the things that the legislature does do if there are additional election reforms, which I hope there will be, that counties can begin processing mail-in ballots earlier. By the way, you know who was also really helpful and then also not at the same time were news organizations, reporters I know, whether it's the Inquirer or CNN or Fox or whatever, who were leading up to election day is, hey, everybody, you're not going to know the results on election night. Just so you know, you're not going to know the results on election night. And then I'll do an interview on election night and I'll be like, do you have the results? Like, you wrote a story that said, don't expect the results on election night. And now you're giving me grief that we don't know of course, we don't know them yet. Well, when are you going to have them? So like 2 hours, 3 hours? Anyway, so it was helpful in informing voters, voter education, saying you're not going to know the results right away. But at the same time, they're still confronting the same reality, which is everyone is used to knowing or think they know what the outcome is right away.
I think Gail had a second question about your arc, where you want to go and what. Go ahead, Gail.
Yes, we all know that sadly you're leaving your post. So I was wondering when the elections for commissioner are. Is that it's not this year, it's next year, 2022?
It's 2023.
2023. Oh, okay.
So I'm leaving, but I'm not dead yet. I'll be around for a while here. It's just that, and I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt before you, if you had a question.
I just wondered how many Republicans were clamoring for your job.
I don't really know. It's really pretty early. Anytime you have a vacant seat, usually get a lot of interest. What I do know is that I had already made the decision well before this election. It wasn't related to threats or any of the other insanity that went on, but I knew after getting reelected in 2019 that this is really it. Like I said, you don't get to take forever to do your job. I wanted to do it for a couple of reasons. One, to let other people know that if they're interested, and they're considering this, they should be serious about it, and they should, we want good people to fill these spots. It's not a high profile position most of the time. Sometimes it is, but it's a very important thing. So it's fair to let people know and not and not game it and wait until the last minute and then announce at the last minute, I'm not running again, but here's my person or something like that. I wanted to make sure that people knew that this is going to be a vacancy, and if they're interested, they should run for it. Mm-hmm. The other thing, and I know this is going to sound deranged, but I also wanted to close the door to myself for running again. Because a lot of people, I think, run for re-election because they don't know what else to do. And they run to just stay where they are and wait for something else to open up to go to. And I think that's also not the right way to do it. So I wanted to also close the door to myself, like tell everybody I'm not running, so I'm not running. Mm-hmm. So when the time comes, right. I'm out of luck if I don't figure out my next step, because I can't run for city commissioner because I said I'm not.
Got it.
The third component of it, I guess, was in terms of what to do next, just as bad as running for re-election because you don't know what else to do, is running for something else because you feel like you need to run for something else. So I'm going to look to see if there's some other opportunity down the line to serve in an elected or appointed capacity. I believe in public service. After I got my PhD, I went right to work in public service. It's something I believe in with my whole heart. So it's certainly something I'll take a look at down the line.
And I just want to thank you for the shout out for election workers, because I'm one of those 8,000 people in Philadelphia and thousands across the US. And frankly, I'm offended at anyone that says that we somehow manipulated this election. We work so hard to make sure that it's accurate. And it's just offensive to all those thousands of people that do all this hard work.
Absolutely.
So I guess I'm sort of managing this right now. And I would agree with you completely. Thank you to all our election workers. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thumbs up. Michelle Kim, did you have a question?
Yes, you did.
Yeah, thank you, Andy.
Mm-hmm.
And first, wanted to thank you, Commissioner Schmidt, for talking with us, answering all these questions, and all of the hard work that you did last year. As everyone has mentioned, it was hard with the tremendous pressure coming from all different sides. So my question was, I was wondering if there are any plans in motion right now to increase language access, as that's one of the primary needs of our LAP communities, specifically immigrant and refugee communities, for like the voting machines, voting materials, and mail-in ballots. I know the new voting machines that just came out, they provide, I believe 16 different languages, and it's fairly easy to add those languages. I know it's still a costly endeavor to add new languages, but it's such a huge issue for our immigrant and refugee communities to provide that access on that level, and make sure that they're participating in the electoral process. So, yeah.
So, and as I understand it, we had a meeting earlier this week about this topic, and really appreciate your understanding in the presidential general election when all these other things are happening. You have so many different priorities competing with one another. And if we're saying, please be patient, please be patient, please be patient with us. And then hopefully we can add additional languages and do other things in years where you don't also have all these other things colliding at the same time, is helpful to allow us to make sure that we're able to execute the election that we did. The voting technology that we selected, and you're right, one big advantage to it at the end of the day was, if you've voted on it, I'm sure you have, it's like a big iPad, essentially. It's a touch screen that produces an ink on paper, human readable ballot at the end for how the voter casts their vote. One advantage to it is that it can be programmed in different languages. So you can select English or Chinese or English or Spanish, or, hopefully down the line, additional languages as well. The problem that I've seen so far, at least in talking to the vendor, isn't the screen. It's whether you can print it in that language. So you could have something in Khmer, but it doesn't print it in Khmer. It prints it in English. So you have a voter verifiable component built into the thing, which is why we got this whole thing to begin with. But that would still be printed in English. So that's definitely a problem that we have to overcome. The advantage is the screen can be printed, the screen can be made available to be in another language. The voter verifiable, human readable, ink on paper candidates that's elected would not be. I think, one challenge that we've seen over time, and I know we've talked to Andy about this and a lot of other people, is it's been a genuine challenge getting people to work election boards in any capacity. It's also true it's hard to get people to work election boards as a translator or interpreter as well. We don't have a cap on that. It's not like we have 100 spots or 200 spots. If we got 1,000 people, we would credential 1,000 people to work as interpreters on election day. Just like the rest of the election bar, the hardest part is getting people to be willing to serve in that capacity on election day. But we'll train and certify every person that we can get, and do our best to staff them or assign them to places where they can have the biggest impact.
Great. Jim Moss, you had a couple more questions. Can you try to figure out which one or ones you want to ask here? Regarding the design of the ballot, I think is probably the one that stands out to me. Jim. Hello. Oh, there he is.
Just read that for me, would you please?
Okay. 2 questions regarding appearance of the ballot. Consult with graphic designers to make the ballot easier to navigate, even using colors. And 2, is there a thought to rotating the ballot positions in different wards?
So the Pennsylvania Department of State worked with a design company to make mail-in ballot applications and absentee ballot applications a little bit easier to read and work with. And if you've ever worked with those before, whether you've filled one out or you've helped other people do it, they were impossible before. Everything was like in a 0.6 font. There was hardly any space between each section where you don't know where to sign. There's no space to sign or fill in the information. And the Department of State worked to kind of create a ballot system, a mail-in application system for voter registration, for absentee ballots, and for mail-in ballots that was a lot easier to work with. So that was a big advantage in terms of registering people and helping them apply for mail-in ballots. I think the voting system we have right now doesn't, even though it's more than black and white, it allows you the option to see things, forgot what it's called. It's like inverted. Black is white and white is black, which is a little bit easier to read for some people who have different visual impairments. Andy, what was the third? There was a third part to it.
The ballot randomization, or not randomization, but yeah, switching around.
So our understanding is that right now that's not legal in Pennsylvania, and that the candidates have to have a fixed position on the ballot. The legislature would need to change the law to allow our county and others to either do a randomization, which would be possible with an electronic system or with a system we have, or one that rotates. So if you had 3 candidates, Ward 1, Division 1, it would be 1, 2, 3. Ward 1, Division 2, it would be 2, 3, 1. Ward 1, Division 3, it would be 3, 1, 2. So you could have some randomization or not, whatever to decrease the impact that ballot position has on the outcome of the election. Because, you know, where somebody falls on the ballot should not have the impact it has on the outcome. And there've been a lot of studies on this and a lot of work on this. It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes number one loses. But you can see it when you look at the results that you certainly would rather be running for common pleas court judge and be number one than be number 27. So randomization is one of those things, or kind of rotation would be one of those things that would make the system a little bit more equitable, I think, for candidates. You wouldn't have people jump in to see what ballot position they got and then drop out just because they're number 27 and not number one. But right now it's not legal.
Right. There were a couple people that were very concerned about you, actually. Kathy Wood says, what are you considering doing next? You sort of hinted at that. And Susan Sorensen says, I would like to make a comment if there's time. Would you guys like to chime in here? I think that's why you're probably asking to make a comment, maybe? Kathy or
Yeah,
Susan?
this is Susan. I was the one who asked to make a comment. And I just wanted to say, in the past year and or so, I've become painfully aware of how fragile our democracy is and how much it relies on the integrity of the people who fill the positions to which they are elected. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you, because I know everything I heard that you came under great attack. You probably, if you weren't already sleeping poorly, you probably joined the rest of us who slept poorly and have been sleeping poorly since all of this hit. And for whatever's next, good luck. But thank you very much for fulfilling the mission of your office with such integrity.
Thank you, Susan. That's very kind of you.
And I forgot Jonathan Paul Fox as well, so wants to know. I think everybody wants to hire you, by the way, so. Or Kathy Woods as well. Anybody want to comment?
If I'm being hired to give really long answers to questions, I'm very good at that. So,
Al Sharif Nassef, who's part of our coalition as well, Language Access Coalition, has a quick question as well.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Thank you again for being so thorough here. I know we've sort of reached time, and you've been very generous with all of us. I'm with All Voting is Local Pennsylvania team. We're a project of leadership conference on civil and human rights, which is America's oldest, largest, and most diverse national coalition, over 200 organizations. We're a voting rights group, and we try to work proactively to prevent barriers to the ballot before they happen. Also, as Andy mentioned, part of a coalition of over 12 local organizations called Citizens for Language Access. And we're working to try to ensure that every eligible voter, especially in marginalized communities who's limited in English proficiency, can exercise their right to vote. I guess my question is kind of two parts. I guess one is a sort of a new question. The other is just kind of a follow-up with my colleague, Michelle Kim. So the first part is, as the Census Bureau prepares to release new data, do you and your colleagues at the Commissioner's Office anticipate any expansions to the Department of Justice Section 203 designation under the Voting Rights Act, which protects limited English proficiency communities for expanded language access? And if so, what steps is your office taking to prepare for an expansion to include the Chinese language, especially in light of some of the concerns with the voting machine that was that you'd raised? So that's the first part. And the second part is that, to amplify my colleague Michelle's point, we've estimated based on census data that between 50 and 90,000 citizens of voting age are limited in English proficiency in the top 5 spoken languages alone. And that's not including Spanish, which is already sort of protected under the Voting Rights Act. So, these communities that are marginalized by virtue of their language backgrounds, what can local organizations do to help your office expand language or access and ensure that these marginalized communities are able to exercise their vote and participate in the democratic process? Thank you.
To try to answer them in reverse order, but by far the biggest one is to assist us in identifying people who are willing to serve on election day as interpreters at the polling places. Like I mentioned earlier, that's been the biggest obstacle. You know, it's easy to advertise things in other languages, or it's expensive, but it's, and aside from the proofing side of it, is not as difficult as it is finding people to serve at polling places for 13 hours a day to assist with language access. We're working with the managing director's office, I think the Office of Immigrant Affairs, to see when the results come back from the census, whether what's required and what isn't required as a result of that, and what the results are. And when that happens, it's one way or another, you know, we will comply with what the law requires. Right now, while we're certainly not satisfying everyone, and that's probably an understatement, we're providing more than what the law requires, or at least that's what our position is. But it's nowhere near as much as we or others are able to do. And when you look at other cities around the country, they're able to make the ballots available in many more languages than we are at present, which is just English and Spanish. Whether Chinese is added to that, simplified Chinese is added to that, we'll see as a result of the census outcome. But providing election board workers that are able to speak in other languages to assist voters in person is by far the most helpful one. One thing that was a little bit challenging with working with Pennsylvania Department of State, and they've done a terrific job. This shouldn't be interpreted as a criticism, but all the applications, all that stuff for registering to vote and all the rest comes through them. They had available voter registration forms, mail-in ballots, and other things in a number of other languages. I think it was like 8 or 10 or 12. Mm-hmm. And then they were gone when the forms changed and all the rest. So that's something that would benefit us in every other county. Whenever we have Department of State do something, it benefits every county in Pennsylvania, as opposed to just Philadelphia sort of doing it on our own. Which the managing director's office is really the department we lean on the most when it comes to assisting us with language access.
Mary has one question. I think you sort of addressed it before, but Mary, about the election of the city commissioners. And then I have a closing comment. Go ahead, Mary.
I was just wondering there's been a lot of discussion over the years that we ought not to really have the row offices because the sheriff's office could be part of the DA or whatever office, and the commissioners should be maybe the records department. And I'm just wondering your comment on that. It seems, it's not necessarily very efficient, all these offices, and a lot of patronage, blah, blah, blah. So it's been a good government kind of going back and forth for a long time.
Yeah, and there are advantages and disadvantages to these different systems. Like I said, one advantage to ours is that we have some checks and balances in the process, and we're not directly under the mayor with one election director. And that's not a criticism of this mayor or any other. But probably, if you remember the Rizzo recall, you probably wouldn't have won.
Of course I do.
That's why I said it. You probably wouldn't want Mayor Rizzo's election director running the Rizzo recall. It's just the thought. So sometimes you have.
Well, the recall was tossed out by the.
I know, but I'm sorry. I mean,
we never got to.
That's right.
Vote on it.
But I'm certain you would not have wanted Mayor Rizzo's person doing that. But if there's a way to better do this, but still keep the checks and balances and having a board of people from more than one party running it, I think that's an advantage. There's no right way to do it, and I think that's why you see every city in the United States sort of do it differently. My background before coming to this job wasn't in elections. It was in at GAO as a senior performance analyst to deliver. How do you deliver services more efficiently and effectively without waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement? I think one thing that I've seen in studies about where there has been row office consolidation, like in Allegheny County, one of the major selling points was that it would save money. And over time, the studies have concluded it doesn't save money. So you could argue whether to do it or not, but one thing that all these studies have shown is that at the end of the day, it doesn't save taxpayer dollars. So the sort of dollar side of it is, to me, not as important as I thought it would have been, only because the studies haven't shown that it saves money at the end of the day at all. You know, we're an independent department, but we use the city's Office of Human Resources. We use the city's payroll department. We use the city's, so when you have had some row office consolidation that matters, it's because they've had their own kind of big offices within those departments to do all those things, and you're able to save money and create efficiencies by having just one office do it. In ours, we're actually pretty integrated into the city government. It's just that we have separate leadership from it. At the end of the day, you know, it's funny, you know, I read things. By the way, Committee 70 was extraordinary this last election, and I don't agree with them on all sorts of things, but they were a big help. And they're someone who in the past has advocated for abolishing the office as an elected office, and others as well. And I listen to what they have to say. There's a group called The Citizen that has also advocated for that as well. But there's a tension there between wanting to abolish the office as an elected office, and at the same time saying you want the people who are making decisions to be directly accountable to voters. Because if they fail, you know, they get, they don't win re-election, or at least in theory, they shouldn't win re-election. And, you know, in different administrations of the city, we've had appointed commissioners who have failed, and they're still there, or have been. They're not necessarily fired as a result of it. So it's the accountability. You either have accountability because they're appointed by somebody else, or accountability because they're elected by the voters. And Mary, it's not like I'm trying not to answer your question. I'm only saying that there's like different ways to do this. And there are different advantages and disadvantages to that system. I think, and this is a very self-centered thing to say, I think one advantage of this system, this election, was you had a person responsible for doing this who was a Republican.
No, we were lucky that you were there. There's no question about that. That's a blessing, and thank you.
Oh,
yeah, I think
Civil
that's a great.
service might be, you know, take it away from, but it's worth looking into.
Yeah, and I think everybody on this call appreciates the work that you did, and your staff, by the way, Seth and Michelle and everybody else on your staff. I just want to say that's a great segue into what can we do as a group that's on this call to help, you know, make sure that you get the resources that you need, and that we're doing things in the best way possible to reach the most amount of voters and make sure that everybody has access to that, because that's how we build a great democracy. So I think that, you know, I've already committed that I'm going to try to help you find resources, not just city, which is city council and the administration, but also beyond the city, because that's how you were so successful this year. I think that other funding came in, and maybe other people here have some ideas about how we can be helpful. So that's my commitment and our commitment. I know we're getting close to 1:30, 1:25.
Okay.
Do you have any other thoughts, Sal?
Just very briefly, in relation to what you're saying, you know, no government agency ever thinks it has enough money to do its job, and that its job is the most important job that any public agency could ever do. That being said, a lot of the resources we got last year, which was a one-time influx, will benefit future elections. The sorting machines that we talked about before, we still have those.
Oh.
So next election, the DA controller election cycle, where no one would give us $10 million to buy machines to help us do our job, we still have those. So we'll benefit from that for many years ahead, whether they're printers for mail-in ballots, whether they're sorters, whether they're extractors, which help us open the ballots, open the envelopes to extract the ballots. All this different machinery that made this possible and much more efficient is something that we still have from that grant that we'll use in future elections. So on the resource side of it, you know, we're always going to advocate for more resources to do more, whether it's voter education or all the rest. The biggest thing that I would think that you all could do would be to continue to be advocates for good governance in laws as they're being considered in Harrisburg right now, which is where we started in this conversation. There's a real appetite to continue to reform the election code, and there's much that can be reformed and for the better. So to continue advocating for that would be a really important thing and would benefit our county and benefit other counties across the Commonwealth.
Well, I thank you for that. And we still have a few more years of Al Schmidt, and we're looking forward to safe and you know, very a lot of participation in future elections. I mean, that's really what we want. And
yeah,
9% is terrible. We don't ever want to get there again. And so we all have to do our part as well. And, you know, encouraging our fellow people to come out and vote and participate in our democracy. So,
well, I just want to say again, if I may, I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you and answer your questions. Like I said, it's great to see some of you in, I guess this is as close to real life as we're getting right now, that I've talked to many times. There are others that I haven't seen in years, like Glenavie Norton and John Cromer and others. So it's really good to see you all, again. And please rely on my office if you need any election information or if we can be of assistance in any way moving forward. I have a very committed team of people. Our department is very committed to all of this. So please take advantage of it.
well, thanks everybody. I think that's it for now. You know, we can all communicate by email. If you have any other questions, we can ask later. But thanks for all your time. Thanks, Al. Thanks everybody for spending the time with us. And don't forget PCCP. This was free, but there are some costs that we had no lunch today, but we still have costs. Thank you.
Thank you.